On the 23rd of November, 1943, in the cramped, lightless hold of a converted cargo ship somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, a young German soldier named Klaus Becker pressed his back against the cold steel wall and tried not to vomit. Around him, 247 other prisoners of war swayed with the motion of the vessel, their faces pale green in the dim emergency lighting, their uniforms still stained with the mud of Tunisia, where they had surrendered 3 weeks earlier. The smell below deck was overwhelming, a mixture of seawater, diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the acrid tang of fear sweat that no amount of ventilation could dispel. Some men lay curled on their sides, too seasick to stand. Others sat with their heads between their knees, muttering prayers in dialects from Bavaria, Prussia, and the Rhineland. Becker was 19 years old, and he was certain he was sailing toward his death. The propaganda had been clear, relentless, and absolutely convincing. For years, the Reich's newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels had painted America as a land of chaos and degeneracy. A nation ruled by gangsters and Jewish bankers, where racial violence erupted in the streets daily, where workers were exploited in hellish factories, where civilization itself was crumbling under the weight of capitalism's greed. Becker had seen the films, the grainy footage of breadlines during the Depression, the photographs of lynchings in the American South, the images of strikes turned violent. His commanding officer had told him before the battle at Kasserine Pass that capture by the Americans meant one of two things: either a bullet in the back of the head or a slow death in a labor camp somewhere in the desert, worked until your hands bled and your body gave out. There would be no mercy, no Geneva Convention, no humanity. The Americans were savages, and Germany's enemies always treated their prisoners with brutality. Every man in that hold had heard the same stories. They had been repeated so many times, in so many different contexts, that they had calcified into absolute truth. Becker's bunkmate, a 32-year-old mechanic from Hamburg named Werner Schmidt, had spent the first 2 days of the voyage asking anyone who would listen whether they thought the Americans would shoot them immediately upon landing or wait until they reached wherever they were going. Another prisoner, barely 18, had written a farewell letter to his mother on a scrap of paper he had hidden in his boot, certain he would never see Germany again. The letter described his love for her, his regret at dying so young, and his hope that she would forgive him for surrendering instead of fighting to the death. He had folded it carefully and tucked it back into his boot, pressed against his ankle like a talisman against the coming darkness. The ship's engines thrummed constantly, a deep mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the hull and into the bones of every man aboard. They had been at sea for 11 days, though time had become elastic and meaningless in the perpetual twilight of the cargo hold. Twice a day, American guards escorted small groups to the deck for fresh air and exercise, 20 minutes under the open sky before they were herded back below. During those brief intervals, Becker would stare out at the endless gray ocean, the waves rising and falling in cold monotony, and wonder what kind of land could produce men capable of crossing such a distance to wage war. The Atlantic seemed impossibly vast, a barrier that separated not just continents, but entire worlds. How could a nation on the far side of this ocean possess the strength to fight on two fronts simultaneously, to supply Britain and the Soviet Union while also pushing into North Africa and preparing for an invasion of Europe? The logic did not align with what he had been taught about American weakness and disorganization. But logic had become a fragile thing. Hunger and exhaustion had worn down the prisoners' capacity for clear thinking. They received 2 meals a day, thin soup and hard bread, barely enough to keep a man upright. Some prisoners hoarded their rations, saving crusts in their pockets in case the food stopped coming entirely. Others ate everything immediately, unable to resist the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. Becker tried to ration himself, but the hunger was relentless, a constant ache that made his hands tremble and his thoughts scatter. He found himself thinking about food more than anything else, not the field rations he had eaten in North Africa, but real food, the meals his mother used to make. Potato dumplings with gravy, roasted pork, apple strudel dusted with sugar. His mouth would water, and then he would remember that his mother was in Berlin, a city under constant bombardment from Allied bombers, and the guilt would crush the fantasy. At night, when the lights were dimmed and the guards retreated to their quarters above, the men would whisper to each other in the darkness. Conversations about home, about what they had left behind, about what might be waiting for them in America. One prisoner, an older man who had fought in the Great War, insisted that the Americans were not as bad as the propaganda claimed. He had been captured by American forces in 1918 and spent 6 months in a camp in France before being repatriated. "They fed us," he said. "They followed the rules. It was not pleasant, but we were not tortured." The younger men did not believe him. That was a different war, they argued, a different America. Things had changed. The world had become darker, more brutal. There was no room for mercy anymore. Becker wanted to believe the old soldier, but doubt clawed at him. He had seen what war did to men, how it stripped away their humanity and left only violence and survival instinct. He had watched friends die in the desert, their bodies torn apart by shell fire, or left to rot under the African sun. He had fired his rifle at distant shapes that might have been Americans or British, never knowing if his bullets had found their mark. War was not a place for kindness or restraint. It was a machine that consumed everything it touched, and he could not imagine that the men operating that machine would show compassion to their enemies. On the 13th day, something changed. Word spread through the hold like wildfire, passed from man to man in urgent whispers. Land had been sighted. They were approaching America. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Some prisoners became agitated, pacing the narrow spaces between bunks, their breathing quick and shallow. Others fell silent, retreating inward, their faces blank masks of resignation. Becker felt his heart begin to hammer in his chest, a rapid staccato rhythm that made him dizzy. This was it. Whatever was going to happen would happen soon. He closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. He had not prayed since before the war, and he did not know if God would listen to a soldier who had killed men in the name of a regime built on hatred. The next morning, the guards came for them earlier than usual. They were ordered to gather their few belongings, a tin cup, a blanket, whatever scraps they had managed to keep, and line up in rows. The hold was filled with the sound of shuffling boots and whispered German, the language of a defeated army preparing for judgment. Becker clutched his blanket to his chest and took his place in line behind Schmidt, who was trembling so badly his teeth chattered. They stood there for what felt like hours, waiting, until finally the guards began marching them up the metal stairs toward the deck. The light hit Becker like a physical blow. After nearly 2 weeks in the dim hold, the morning sun was blinding, and he had to shield his eyes with his hand as he stumbled onto the deck. The cold November air bit at his face, sharp and clean, washing away the stench of confinement. He blinked rapidly, trying to adjust, and when his vision finally cleared, he froze. The horizon was no longer empty. Ahead, rising out of the gray water like something from a dream, was land. But not just land. Buildings, massive buildings, taller than anything Becker had ever seen, stretching upward into the sky in geometric towers of stone and glass. The skyline of New York City filled his vision, a sprawling wall of architecture that seemed impossible, unreal. He had seen photographs, grainy images in newspapers, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale of it. The city looked untouched, pristine, every window intact, every structure standing proud. There were no ruins, no bombed-out shells of buildings, no smoke rising from rubble. It was a city at peace, a city that had never known the terror of sirens and explosions in the night. Schmidt stood beside him, his mouth hanging open. "Where are the bombs?" he whispered. "Where is the destruction?" Becker could not answer. He stared at the skyline, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told. Germany's cities were burning. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, all of them scarred by Allied bombing raids that came night after night, turning neighborhoods into graveyards of brick and ash. His own mother's letters had described the terror, the way the sirens wailed and everyone rushed to the shelters, praying the bombs would fall somewhere else. The propaganda had promised that America was suffering too, that their industrial cities were being crippled by German U-boats and sabotage, that their people were starving and desperate. But the evidence before his eyes told a different story. As the ship drew closer, more details emerged. Lights. The city had lights. Even in daylight, he could see that the buildings were illuminated, their windows glowing. In Germany, blackout regulations were absolute. Every window covered, every street lamp extinguished, entire cities plunged into darkness to hide from the bombers above. But here, there was no blackout. The Americans were not afraid. They did not need to hide. The ship's horn blasted, a deep, mournful sound that echoed across the water. Becker flinched, and then he saw it. Rising from the harbor, green and enormous, her torch held high, the Statue of Liberty stood watching their approach. He had seen her image in propaganda posters, always depicted as a symbol of American hypocrisy, a false idol for a nation that preached freedom while practicing oppression. But standing there, seeing her with his own eyes, Becker felt something shift inside him. She looked dignified, almost serene, welcoming the ship even though it carried her nation's enemies. A prisoner next to him began to weep, quietly at first, then in great shuddering sobs that shook his whole body. Becker did not know his name, but he understood. The man was not crying out of fear. He was crying because he had just realized they had been lied to, all of them, about everything. The propaganda had painted America as weak, divided, collapsing under its own contradictions. But the skyline told a different story. This was a nation of staggering power, a country so vast and wealthy it could build cities that touched the clouds while simultaneously waging war on two continents. The factories that produced the tanks, the planes, the ships that were grinding Germany into defeat, they were here, untouched, operating at full capacity while German industry crumbled under constant bombardment. Becker had fought in North Africa, had seen the endless streams of American equipment rolling off the transports, more trucks and jeeps and artillery pieces than he could count. He had wondered where it all came from, how the Americans could produce so much. Now he knew. It came from this, from a nation so wealthy it did not even need to ration its lights. The ship slowed, engines reversing as tugs moved into position to guide it toward the dock. The prisoners stood in silent rows on the deck, staring at the city, each man lost in his own thoughts. Some faces showed confusion, others fear, and a few, like Becker's, showed the first glimmers of a terrible understanding. They had been told they were fighting for survival, that Germany was surrounded by enemies determined to destroy her. But if America looked like this, untouched and thriving, then what did Germany look like to American eyes? What did the Reich appear to be from this side of the ocean? Schmidt turned to Becker, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We cannot win this war, can we?" Becker did not answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the skyline, on the towers of glass and steel that represented a kind of power Germany had never possessed. "No," he said finally, "we cannot." The ship docked, and the guards began shouting orders in English, their voices sharp and efficient. The prisoners were formed into columns and marched down the gangplank onto American soil. Becker's legs felt unsteady after so long at sea, and he stumbled, catching himself on the shoulder of the man in front of him. The dock was crowded with soldiers, workers, equipment, all moving with practiced efficiency. No one seemed particularly interested in the German prisoners. They were just another shipment, another batch of defeated men to be processed and sent inland. As they marched through the port, Becker caught glimpses of the city beyond the warehouses, cars moving on paved streets, shops with their windows full of goods, people, ordinary civilians, going about their lives without fear. A woman walked past, pushing a baby carriage, and she glanced at the column of prisoners with mild curiosity before continuing on her way. In Germany, mothers kept their children inside when the sirens sounded, and the streets emptied as everyone fled to the shelters. Here, life continued, uninterrupted. They were loaded onto trains, boxcars with barred windows and wooden benches. The doors closed with a metallic clang, and the train lurched forward, pulling away from the coast and heading inland. Through the windows, Becker watched America slide past. Farmland, intact and cultivated, small towns with church steeples and white houses, forests that had never been touched by artillery fire. Everything looked clean, orderly, prosperous. He thought about the newsreels he had watched before the war, the images of American poverty during the Depression, the breadlines in the Hoovervilles. That America, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. This America, the one rolling past his window, was a giant that Germany had awakened, and now that giant was coming to crush them. The train carried them west, away from the coast, into the heart of the country. Night fell, and through the windows Becker could see lights. Town after town lit up against the darkness, no blackout curtains, no fear of bombers. The sight was mesmerizing and horrifying in equal measure. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes, but the image remained burned into his mind. America was not suffering. America was not even inconvenienced. The war that was tearing Europe apart, the war that had taken his friends and destroyed his city, barely touched this place. In the darkness of the boxcar, surrounded by exhausted, confused men who had believed they were fighting for something righteous, Klaus Becker understood the truth. They had lost before they had even begun. Not because they lacked courage or discipline, but because they had been lied to about the nature of their enemy. America was not weak. America was a colossus, and Germany had attacked it. The consequences of that decision were now unavoidable. The train rolled on through the night, carrying its cargo of prisoners deeper into the country, and Becker sat in the darkness, watching the lights of towns he would never know pass by his window, each one a reminder of how completely his world had changed. The train journey lasted 3 days, and with each passing hour, the gap between what Klaus Becker had been taught and what he was witnessing grew wider until it became a chasm he could no longer ignore. The boxcar was crowded, 42 men pressed together on wooden benches, but the guards had left the barred windows open, allowing fresh air to circulate and giving the prisoners an unobstructed view of America as it rolled past. What they saw through those windows systematically dismantled every assumption they had carried across the Atlantic. The first shock came during a stop at a small station somewhere in Pennsylvania. The train had pulled onto a siding to allow a freight train to pass, and the prisoners sat in their locked cars, watching American soldiers move across the platform. These were not frontline troops, just ordinary GIs manning the station, handling logistics, smoking cigarettes, and talking in relaxed voices that carried through the crisp November air. One soldier unwrapped a chocolate bar, a thick, dark rectangle that he bit into casually, as if such luxuries were commonplace. Another was eating an apple, taking huge bites, and then tossing the core into a trash bin that was already half full of discarded food. Becker watched this and felt something twist inside his chest. Werner Schmidt pressed his face against the bars, his eyes fixed on the soldiers. "They are eating chocolate," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Chocolate? When was the last time you had chocolate, Klaus?" Becker could not remember. Before the war, certainly. Maybe 1939 or 40, when rationing had not yet tightened its grip completely. In Germany, chocolate had become a distant memory, something mentioned in whispered conversations about better times. His mother's last letter had described how she traded her wedding ring for a loaf of bread and a small piece of cheese. The gold band she had worn for 23 years, exchanged for one meal. And here, American soldiers were eating chocolate like it was nothing, like the world was not starving. The soldier with the chocolate finished it and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, American cigarettes with white paper and a printed label. He lit one, took a long drag, and then offered the pack to his companion. They stood there smoking, laughing about something, completely at ease. In the boxcar, several German prisoners who smoked stared at this display with naked hunger. Cigarettes in Germany were more valuable than money. Men killed for them. Families traded heirlooms for a handful of tobacco. The black market thrived on cigarettes, and possession of American brands captured from the enemy marked a man as wealthy beyond measure. But these soldiers smoked them without thought, as if the supply was endless. A young prisoner named Otto Fischer, barely 20 years old, turned away from the window and sat down heavily on the bench. His hands were shaking. "I do not understand," he said. "They told us America was suffering. They told us their people were hungry, that their soldiers were poorly equipped. But look at them. Look." No one answered because there was no answer to give. The evidence was undeniable. The American soldiers were well fed, their uniforms clean and properly fitted, their boots new. They moved with the easy confidence of men who knew they had everything they needed and more. The contrast with the German army was stark. In North Africa, Becker's unit had survived on half rations for months. Their uniforms were patched and repatched, their boots held together with wire, their equipment a mixture of German-issue gear and whatever they could scavenge from captured supplies. They had fought like lions, but they had fought hungry, poorly supplied, always waiting for shipments that came later and later as the Allied blockade tightened its grip. The train lurched back into motion, and the station disappeared behind them. The landscape opened up into rolling hills covered in forests that had never seen artillery fire. The trees stood tall and unmolested, their branches bare for winter but intact. No shrapnel scars, no burned stumps marking where shells had exploded. Becker had grown up in the countryside outside Nuremberg, and he remembered forests like these. But the last time he had seen German forests, they had been filled with refugees fleeing the advance of Allied forces, the trees cut down for fuel, the land scarred by the machinery of war. These American forests looked untouched, pristine, as if war was something that happened elsewhere, to other people. The train passed through a small town, and Becker saw children playing in a schoolyard. They were bundled in winter coats, chasing each other in some game, their laughter audible even over the rumble of the train. A teacher stood nearby, watching them, her arms crossed against the cold. The scene was so normal, so utterly peaceful, that it seemed like something from a photograph taken before the world had gone mad. In Germany, schools operated in basements now, if they operated at all. Children learned to recognize the sound of different aircraft, to distinguish British bombers from American ones by the pitch of their engines. They practiced diving under desks when the sirens sounded, and teachers kept gas masks stored in every classroom, ready for distribution. Schmidt was writing in a small notebook he had somehow managed to keep hidden from the guards. He wrote in cramped German script, filling page after page with observations. He had been keeping this journal since their capture in Tunisia, and he guarded it jealously, convinced that someday someone would need to know what they had witnessed. Becker leaned over and read what Schmidt was writing. "We have been traveling for 2 days across the American interior, and I have not seen a single bombed building, not one destroyed bridge, not one sign that this country is at war. The towns are lit at night, the people look well fed, children play in the streets without fear. Meanwhile, letters from home tell us that Hamburg is burning, that Berlin is in ruins, that our families are starving in cellars while the bombs fall. How can this be? How can they be winning and we be losing when we are the ones who were told we were superior?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable and damning. Becker turned back to the window and watched America continue its steady procession. Farmland stretched to the horizon, field after field of harvested crops, the earth turned and ready for spring planting. There were no tank tracks tearing through the soil, no craters where bombs had fallen, no abandoned equipment rusting in the fields. Everything spoke of order, prosperity, and an untouchable distance from the war that was consuming Europe. That afternoon, the train stopped at a water station to refill its tanks. The stop was supposed to be brief, but something had delayed them, and the prisoners sat in their cars under the pale winter sun, waiting. A small crowd of locals had gathered near the tracks, curious to see the German prisoners. They were ordinary people, farmers in overalls, women in practical dresses, a few children clinging to their mothers' skirts. They stood at a respectful distance, staring at the boxcars with expressions ranging from curiosity to pity. One woman, middle-aged with graying hair tied back in a bun, approached the train carrying a basket. A guard moved to intercept her, but she spoke to him in rapid English, gesturing at the basket. The guard hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside. The woman walked up to the boxcar where Becker and his companions were held and began pulling items from her basket. Apples. She was handing out apples through the bars, one to each prisoner who could reach. Her face was kind but sad, and she spoke in English that none of them understood, soft words that sounded like reassurance or sympathy. Becker reached through the bars and took an apple from her hand. It was large, red, and perfect, without blemish or bruise. He stared at it, this simple fruit, and felt his throat tighten. The woman met his eyes and nodded, then moved down the length of the car, distributing more apples until her basket was empty. When she finished, she stepped back and raised her hand in a small wave before turning and walking back to the crowd. Several other civilians followed her example, bringing bread, cookies, even a few bottles of milk. The guards did not stop them. They stood to the side and watched, their rifles slung over their shoulders, as the townspeople fed their enemies. Fisher bit into his apple, and tears began streaming down his face. He did not sob or make a sound, but the tears came anyway, cutting tracks through the dirt on his cheeks. "We are the enemy," he said. "We tried to kill them, and they are giving us food." Becker bit into his own apple, and the sweetness exploded on his tongue, so intense after months of bland rations that it almost hurt. He chewed slowly, savoring it, and thought about what this meant. These people had no reason to be kind. America was fighting a brutal war across 2 oceans, losing thousands of sons to combat. These German prisoners represented the nation that had aligned itself with Japan, the nation whose submarines had sunk American ships, whose army had declared war on the United States. Yet here were ordinary Americans, bringing food to feed them, treating them not as monsters, but as human beings who were hungry. The train started moving again, and the town fell away behind them. But the memory of that woman's face, the kindness in her eyes, stayed with Becker. It was incompatible with everything he had been taught about Americans. They were supposed to be callous, materialistic, concerned only with profit and power. But that woman had gained nothing from her act of generosity. She had simply seen men who were hungry and decided to feed them. As the sun began to set, the train passed through a larger city, somewhere in Ohio or Indiana. Becker was not sure which. The city was alive with lights, street lamps glowing, windows illuminated, neon signs advertising restaurants and shops. Cars moved through the streets, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. People walked on sidewalks, going about their evening routines, visiting shops, meeting friends, living lives that seemed entirely disconnected from the war. Becker pressed his face against the bars and watched this alien world slide past, trying to comprehend it. In Germany, blackout regulations were absolute and ruthlessly enforced. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets, and any hint of light could bring a fine or worse. People lived in darkness, navigating their own homes by memory, cooking cold meals because the glow of a stove might attract bombers. The nights were filled with the sound of aircraft engines and the whistle of falling bombs, and morning always revealed new ruins, new casualties, new reasons to despair. But here, in this American city, the lights burned freely and life continued without interruption. Schmidt had stopped writing and was simply staring out the window, his notebook forgotten in his lap. "They do not know what war is," he said finally. "Not really. They send their soldiers to fight in other countries, but their own land remains untouched. They have never heard bombs falling on their cities, never watched their homes burn, never dug through rubble looking for their families." Becker nodded slowly. "That is their strength," he said. "That is why they will win. They can produce, manufacture, train soldiers, build weapons, and their factories never stop because there are no bombs falling on them. We bomb London, and they bomb Berlin. But who bombs New York? Who bombs Chicago? No one. They are untouchable." The realization settled over the prisoners like a heavy blanket. Germany had started a war it could not win because it had misjudged its opponent so completely. The propaganda had convinced them that America was weak, divided, incapable of sustained effort. But the evidence streaming past their windows told a different story. This was a nation of vast resources, unified purpose, and industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could match. The factories they had seen from the train, the warehouses, the freight yards filled with equipment and supplies, all of it spoke to a level of production that was simply overwhelming. That night, as the train rolled through the darkness, Becker lay on the hard wooden bench and stared at the ceiling of the boxcar. Around him, other prisoners slept fitfully, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Schmidt sat awake, writing by the faint light that filtered through the windows from the moon outside. Becker watched him for a while, then spoke quietly. "What are you writing now?" Schmidt did not look up from his notebook. "The truth," he said, "so that someday someone will know. We were lied to about everything. America is not weak. America is not divided. America is not suffering. We were told we were fighting subhumans, degenerate people who could not stand against German superiority. But look at what they have built. Look at what they can do. We were lied to, and the lie has killed us. Becker closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. His mind kept returning to the images of the day. The chocolate bar, the children playing, the woman with the apples, the city with its lights blazing against the darkness. Each image was a nail in the coffin of his belief, his faith in the Reich's narrative about the war. He had been a loyal soldier, had followed orders, had trusted that his leaders knew what they were doing. But that trust was crumbling, eroded by the undeniable reality of what he had seen. The next morning brought more of the same, more farmland, more small towns, more evidence of a nation untouched by the devastation of war. The train passed a factory complex, smoke rising from its chimneys, shifts of workers moving in and out through the gates. The factory was producing something, probably war materials, and it was doing so without fear of air raids, without interruption, at full capacity 24 hours a day. Becker thought about the factories in Germany, how they moved underground to escape the bombing, how production slowed to a crawl as resources dwindled and workers were conscripted. The industrial competition was not even close. It was like watching a child with a stick face off against a man with a machine gun. On the afternoon of the third day, the train finally slowed as it approached its destination. The prisoners stirred, gathering their meager belongings, preparing for whatever came next. Through the windows, Becker could see more camps in the distance, rows of barracks surrounded by fences, guard towers rising at regular intervals. This, at least, looked familiar. This was what he had expected. But even as the train came to a stop and the guards began unlocking the boxcar doors, Becker knew that nothing would ever be the same. He had seen America, the real America, not the propaganda version, and that sight had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The war was not what he had been told. The enemy was not what he had believed. And as he stepped down from the train onto American soil, Klaus Becker carried with him the terrible knowledge that everything he had fought for was built on lies. The guards led them off the train in columns of 4, boots crunching on the gravel beside the tracks as the Texas sun bore down with an intensity that reminded Klaus Becker of North Africa. The camp lay ahead, surrounded by a double fence of barbed wire with guard towers positioned at each corner, their searchlights visible even in daylight. This was what Becker had expected, what he had steeled himself for during the 3-day journey. Barbed wire and guns, the architecture of imprisonment. Yet, as they marched through the gates of Camp Hearn, past the American sentries who barely glanced at them, something felt wrong. Not wrong in the sense of threatening, but wrong in the sense of unexpected. The camp was too organized, too clean, too orderly to match the horror stories they had been told. The processing took hours. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, issued a number and a set of clothing. The Americans were methodical, working through a system that had clearly been refined through the processing of thousands of prisoners before them. Becker stood in line, waiting his turn, watching the faces of the American soldiers who ran the intake process. They looked bored more than anything else, going through the motions of bureaucracy with the weary efficiency of men who had done this too many times. No one was beaten. No one was threatened. When one prisoner stumbled because his legs were still unsteady from the train, a guard caught him by the elbow and steadied him, then pointed him toward a bench where he could sit down. After processing, they were led to their barracks. Becker had expected something from the propaganda films, overcrowded cells with dirt floors and buckets for toilets. What he found instead was a long wooden building with rows of metal frame beds, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, and 2 folded blankets. The building was clean, recently swept, with windows that could be opened for ventilation. There were electric lights hanging from the ceiling. At one end stood a wood-burning stove for heat. The floor was wooden planks, elevated off the ground. It was not luxurious, not even comfortable by civilian standards, but it was far better than anything Becker had imagined. Werner Schmidt walked slowly down the center aisle between the beds, touching each frame as he passed as if to confirm it was real. "There are beds," he said, his voice filled with wonder. Actual beds. Not straw on the ground, not concrete. Beds. Fisher chose a bunk near a window and sat down on it carefully, testing the mattress. It gave slightly under his weight, thin but serviceable. He looked up at Becker with confusion written across his young face. Why would they give us beds? We are prisoners. We are the enemy. The question had no immediate answer, so Becker simply claimed the bunk next to Fisher's and began storing his few possessions in the footlocker at the end of the bed. Each prisoner had been given one, a simple metal box with a lock for personal items. The idea that they were allowed to have personal items, to have possessions they could secure, was itself baffling. In the propaganda, prisoners were stripped of everything, reduced to numbers, treated like animals. But here they had beds and footlockers and windows that opened to let in fresh air. That evening, they experienced their first meal in the camp, and it shattered another layer of their expectations. The mess hall was a large wooden building with long tables and benches, capable of seating several hundred men at once. The prisoners lined up with metal trays, and American soldiers working behind a serving counter doled out portions. Becker watched in stunned silence as his tray was filled. Mashed potatoes, green beans, a thick slice of meatloaf, 2 pieces of bread with a pat of butter, a cup of coffee, and for dessert, a piece of apple pie. He stared at the tray in his hands, at the amount of food, and felt his hands begin to tremble. Schmidt, standing behind him in line, received his own tray and simply stood there, frozen, until another prisoner bumped into him and snapped him out of his trance. "This is more food than I have seen in 2 years," Schmidt whispered. "More than a single meal. More than a week of meals back home." They sat at one of the long tables surrounded by other prisoners who were equally stunned. Some men began eating immediately, shoveling food into their mouths as if afraid it might disappear. Others ate slowly, savoring each bite, trying to make it last. Becker cut a piece of the meatloaf and put it in his mouth. It was warm, seasoned with herbs, real meat. Not the sawdust extended sausage they had eaten in the army, not the thin gruel they had survived on in North Africa, but actual beef. The mashed potatoes were creamy with butter. The green beans had been cooked with bacon, the bread was soft and fresh, and the pie, the apple pie, was sweet and rich in a way that made his eyes water. Across the table, an older prisoner named Dieter Hoffman sat with his head bowed, his hands gripping his fork so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He was not eating, just staring at his tray. Becker leaned forward. "Hoffman, are you all right?" Hoffman looked up and his eyes were red. "My wife," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "My wife and daughters are in Dresden. Her last letter said they were eating potato peels and grass because there was no food. The ration cards give them 300 grams of bread per day, and most weeks the bread does not come. And here, I sit with more food on this tray than they will see in a month. How is that possible? How can we be prisoners and eat better than our own families?" No one answered because there was no answer that made sense. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on them as they ate their meals in silence, each man wrestling with his own thoughts. The propaganda had promised that Germany would prevail because of superior will, superior organization, superior strength. But if Germany was winning, why were German civilians starving while German prisoners in America ate meatloaf and pie? The logic did not hold. Something fundamental had been wrong with their understanding of the war. The days that followed established a routine that further eroded their preconceptions. Réveillé at 6 in the morning, followed by breakfast, then work assignments, or, for those without work that day, free time that could be spent reading, writing letters, or participating in organized activities. Lunch at noon, more work or free time in the afternoon, dinner at 5, evening recreation until lights out at 10. The structure was military but not harsh, and the prisoners were treated not as criminals, but as men who simply needed to be kept occupied. The camp had a library, stocked with books in German that had been donated by various organizations. Prisoners could check out books and read in their bunks or in a common room that had been set up with tables and chairs. There was a canteen where prisoners could spend scrip they earned from work details, buying cigarettes, candy, toiletries, and other small luxuries. The scrip system was explained to them by a camp administrator, a bored-looking sergeant who spoke broken German. "You work, you earn 80 cents per day in scrip. You can spend it at the canteen or save it, up to you. 80 cents per day was not much by American standards, but it was more than most German soldiers had seen during the entire war. And the fact that they could buy cigarettes, real American cigarettes, at the canteen seemed almost obscene. Fisher spent his first day's earnings on a Hershey bar and sat on his bunk eating it slowly, chocolate melting on his fingers, a look of pure disbelief on his face. Medical care was provided by a camp infirmary staffed with American doctors and medics. When Schmidt developed an infected cut on his hand from work detail, he was treated immediately, given antibiotics and clean bandages, and told to return if the infection did not improve. The doctor who treated him was professional, thorough, and showed no hostility. He cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic that stung, and wrapped it carefully. "Stay clean. Keep it dry," he said through a translator. "You will be fine." Schmidt stared at his bandaged hand as they walked back to the barracks. "They gave me medicine," he said. "Antibiotics. In the Army, we ran out of medical supplies months ago. Men died from infections because we had nothing to treat them with. But here, they give medicine to prisoners." The cognitive dissonance grew stronger with each passing day. The camp even had organized recreation. There were sports leagues, with prisoners forming teams to play soccer on a field that had been cleared and maintained specifically for that purpose. There were theater productions, with prisoners writing and performing plays in German for their fellow inmates. There was a small orchestra made up of prisoners who had been musicians in civilian life, and they gave concerts on Sunday evenings, playing everything from classical pieces to popular German songs. The Americans provided instruments, sheet music, and even an audience sometimes, guards who would stand at the edge of the field or the makeshift theater and watch, occasionally applauding. Work assignments began in the second week. The United States faced a severe labor shortage with millions of men serving overseas, and farms across Texas desperately needed help. Prisoners were offered the opportunity to work on local ranches and farms, and while the work was hard, it came with additional benefits. Those who worked outside the camp received better meals, more scrip, and a chance to see more of America beyond the barbed wire. Becker was assigned to a ranch about 20 miles from the camp, along with 15 other prisoners. They were loaded into the back of a truck each morning before dawn and driven out to the property, a sprawling cattle operation owned by a man named William Harrison. Harrison was in his 50s, weathered by decades of Texas sun, and he greeted the German prisoners with a mixture of wariness and pragmatism. He needed hands to work his cattle, and he did not particularly care where those hands came from as long as they did the job. The work was backbreaking, mending fences in the Texas heat, herding cattle across vast pastures, loading hay bales, digging irrigation ditches. Becker's hands, soft from months of captivity, developed blisters that burst and reformed as calluses. His back ached from labor he had not performed since his youth on his father's small farm in Germany. But the work had a rhythm to it, a purpose that made the days pass more quickly. And at midday, Harrison's wife would bring out lunch for the workers, sandwiches thick with ham and cheese, cold lemonade, sometimes cookies or cake. She treated the German prisoners the same as she treated the few American farmhands who worked alongside them, with a brisk efficiency that suggested she had more important things to worry about than old grievances. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into the work detail, Harrison approached Becker as he was repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a bull. The rancher watched him work for a few minutes, then nodded approvingly. "You know your way around a fence," he said through the translator who accompanied them. "You grow up on a farm?" Becker straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yes, sir. My father had a small farm outside Nuremberg. Dairy cows, some pigs, vegetables." Harrison pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Becker. The gesture was casual, almost friendly. Becker hesitated, then accepted, and Harrison lit it for him with a silver lighter. They stood there for a moment, smoking in silence, looking out over the pasture where cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. "This war is a hell of a thing," Harrison said finally. "I got a son in the Pacific. He is 19, fighting Japanese on some island I cannot even pronounce. And here I am, employing German prisoners to work my ranch because all my regular hands got drafted. World has gone crazy." Becker did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and took another drag on his cigarette. The tobacco was smooth, American-made, better than anything he had smoked during the war. "You seem like a decent enough fellow," Harrison continued. "Hard worker, do not cause trouble. I suppose you were just following orders, same as my boy is doing right now. That is what soldiers do, right? They follow orders and hope they make it home." "Yes, sir," Becker said quietly. "That is what soldiers do." Harrison flicked ash from his cigarette and looked at Becker with an expression that was hard to read. "When this war is over, you will go back to Germany, I suppose, back to your father's farm." "If it is still there," Becker said. "The last letter I received said the RAF had bombed Nuremberg twice, many buildings destroyed. I do not know if my family's farm survived." Harrison nodded slowly, his face grave. "My grandfather came from Germany," he said. 1872, sailed from Hamburg to Galveston, built a life here, raised a family, became an American. He used to tell me stories about the old country. I suppose that is why I do not hate you boys, as much as I probably should. You are not so different from what my grandfather was. Just men trying to make a living, caught up in something bigger than yourselves." The conversation stayed with Becker long after they had finished their cigarettes and returned to work. Harrison's words had been kind, almost sympathetic, and that sympathy was perhaps the most disorienting thing of all. How could he reconcile being treated with decency, even friendship, by the very people he had been fighting against? How could he square the reality of his treatment as a prisoner with the propaganda that had painted Americans as brutal, uncivilized savages? Other prisoners had similar experiences. Fisher had been assigned to a different farm where the owner's daughter, a young woman named Mary, had taken it upon herself to teach him English. She would sit with him during lunch breaks, pointing at objects and saying the English words slowly while he repeated them. She laughed at his accent, but not unkindly, and she brought him books to help him learn. The interaction was innocent, chaperoned by her father and the ever-present guards, but it represented a kind of human connection that defied every expectation Fisher had carried with him from Germany. Schmidt worked at a cotton farm where the owner, an older man named Thomas Jefferson Boyd, treated him almost like a son. Boyd had lost his own son at Guadalcanal the year before, and seeing young German prisoners working his land seemed to ease some of his grief. He taught Schmidt about cotton cultivation, about the soil and the climate, about the economics of farming in America. He spoke to him as an equal, not as an enemy, and when Schmidt made a mistake, Boyd corrected him patiently rather than harshly. Back at the camp in the evenings, the prisoners would gather and share their experiences, trying to make sense of it all. They sat on their bunks or in the common room, smoking cigarettes bought with their scrip, and talked about the Americans they were meeting, the families who fed them, the farmers who treated them with respect. "How can we be the enemy," Fisher asked one night, "when they treat us better than our own government ever did?" "I have eaten more in the past month than I ate in the entire year before my capture. I have seen a doctor. I have been paid for my work. An American girl is teaching me English because she thinks I should be educated. This is not how you treat your enemies." Hoffman, the older prisoner who had broken down during that first meal, spoke quietly from his bunk. "It is how you treat your enemies when you are confident you have already won. They do not fear us. They do not hate us. We are simply a labor shortage problem to be solved. That is what we have been reduced to. Not a threat, just a workforce." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. If America saw them not as dangerous enemies but as convenient labor, what did that say about Germany's chances in this war? What did it say about the propaganda that had promised victory, that had assured them they were fighting for survival against a desperate, weakened foe? Becker lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for sleep. Men snoring, someone coughing, the distant footsteps of guards on patrol. Through the window, he could see stars, the same stars that shone over Germany, over Nuremberg, over whatever was left of his family's farm. He thought about his mother, about whether she was safe, about whether she had enough to eat. He thought about the contrast between her suffering and his relative comfort. He thought about Harrison and his missing son, about Mary teaching Fisher English, about Boyd mourning his boy while teaching Schmidt about cotton. The cognitive dissonance was no longer just uncomfortable. It was unbearable. Everything they had been told was a lie. Everything they had believed was propaganda. The Americans were not monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers, who treated their prisoners with a level of decency that Germany had never shown to anyone. And that realization, more than anything else, told Becker the truth about the war. They had lost not because they lacked courage or skill, but because they had fought for a lie while their enemies fought for something real. The knowledge was devastating, and it changed everything. The transformation was not universal, and it did not come without pain. As the weeks turned to months and the prisoners settled into the routine of camp life, the letters from home began arriving with increasing regularity, and each one brought news that made the contrast between their circumstances and those of their families more stark, more impossible to reconcile. Klaus Becker received his first letter from his mother in mid-January of 1944, nearly 2 months after his arrival in Texas. The envelope was thin, the paper inside covered in his mother's cramped handwriting, every millimeter used to conserve the scarce resource. He read it alone, sitting on his bunk while the other men were at dinner, and with each sentence, the weight on his chest grew heavier. She wrote about the bombings, how the Allied raids came now almost every night, wave after wave of aircraft that turned the sky into a hellscape of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. She described the sound, how the bombs whistled as they fell, how the earth shook when they hit, how the screams of the dying mixed with the wail of sirens to create a symphony of terror. Their neighborhood had been hit 3 times. The bakery where she had bought bread for 30 years was gone, replaced by a smoking crater. The Hoffmans, their neighbors for 2 decades, had died in their cellar when a direct hit collapsed the building on top of them. She and Becker's younger sister now slept in the public shelter, a converted subway tunnel that held hundreds of people pressed together in the darkness, breathing. Stale air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. The food situation was desperate. The ration cards provided less each month, and even those meager allotments were often unavailable. She had traded her pearl necklace, a wedding gift from Becker's father who had died in the Great War, for 3 pounds of potatoes and a jar of lard. She wrote about boiling potato peels to make soup, about mixing sawdust into flour to make the bread stretch further, about how thin his sister had become, how her ribs showed through her dress like the bars of a cage. "We are surviving," his mother wrote, "but I do not know for how much longer. The city is dying around us, Klaus. Every day more buildings fall. Every day more people disappear. I pray you are safe wherever you are. I pray this war ends soon, before there is nothing left of us to save." Becker folded the letter carefully and sat in silence, his hands shaking. Around him, the barracks was quiet. Most of the men still at the mess hall, eating their dinner of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and chocolate cake for dessert. He thought about that meal, about the abundance of it, about how he had complained to himself that morning that the coffee was too weak. His mother was boiling potato peels, his sister's ribs were showing, and he was complaining about weak coffee. The guilt was crushing, irrational, but undeniable. He was eating better as a prisoner than his family was, as civilians in their own country. How was that possible? How could the enemy treat him better than his own government treated his mother? Werner Schmidt received similar news from Hamburg. His wife and 2 young sons had evacuated to the countryside after their apartment building was destroyed, but the rural area offered little refuge. Food was scarce everywhere, fuel for heating non-existent, medical care unavailable. His oldest son, only 7 years old, had developed pneumonia during the winter, and his wife's letter described how she had sat up with him for 3 nights, with no medicine, no doctor, just prayer and cold compresses. The boy had survived, but barely, and he remained weak, coughing blood. Schmidt read this letter sitting at one of the tables in the common room, and when he finished, he put his head in his hands and wept openly, his shoulders shaking with grief and rage and helplessness. Other prisoners received worse news or no news at all. Letters stopped coming from certain cities after particularly heavy bombing raids, and the silence was often more terrible than the worst news could have been. Otto Fischer had not heard from his family in Berlin since December. He wrote letter after letter, sending them through the Red Cross channels, but received no response. He began to withdraw, spending his days sitting alone, staring at nothing, his young face aged by worry and fear. No one knew what to say to him. What comfort could you offer a man who did not know if his parents were alive or dead? The cognitive dissonance that had begun as confusion now evolved into something deeper and more destabilizing. The prisoners found themselves living in two incompatible realities. In one reality, they were enemies of America, soldiers of the Reich, defenders of the fatherland against the forces of international Jewry and Bolshevism. In the other reality, they were well-fed workers earning wages, treated with basic human decency by the very people they had been taught to hate, living better than their own families back home. These realities could not coexist, and the psychological strain of trying to hold both in mind at once began to fracture the camp's population into distinct groups. Some prisoners, like Becker and Schmidt, began to question everything. If the Americans were supposed to be the brutal enemy, why did they provide food, medical care, and fair treatment? If Germany was winning the war, why were German cities being bombed to rubble while American cities remained untouched? If the Reich was superior, why was it losing? These questions had no good answers, at least not answers compatible with Nazi ideology, and the men who asked them began to drift away from the party faithful, forming their own groups, having their own quiet conversations about what the war really meant. But others held firm to their beliefs, and as the questions grew louder, so did their opposition. There were committed Nazis among the prisoners, men who had joined the party before the war, who had risen through the SS or other organizations, who genuinely believed in Hitler's vision of German supremacy. These men saw the questions as betrayal, as weakness, as contamination by enemy propaganda. They organized themselves, created their own hierarchy within the camp, and began to enforce ideological purity with threats and violence. The tensions came to a head in March of 1944, when a prisoner named Ernst Müller was found beaten nearly to death in the latrine. Müller had been vocal about his changing views, had openly stated in the mess hall that Germany had no chance of winning, that the war was a mistake, that Hitler had led them into catastrophe. That night, 5 men had cornered him and delivered a message with their fists and boots. "You are a traitor to the fatherland," they told him as they beat him. "You have forgotten who you are." The camp authorities investigated, but no one would testify. The code of silence held even among those who disagreed with the beating, because to inform on fellow Germans to the Americans felt like a deeper betrayal than allowing vigilante justice to proceed. Müller recovered after 2 weeks in the infirmary, but the incident cast a shadow over the camp. Men chose their words more carefully, kept their doubts private, avoided controversy. But the questions did not go away. They festered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each letter from home, each piece of news about the war's progression, each interaction with Americans that contradicted the propaganda they had been fed. Becker found himself thinking constantly about the arithmetic of the war, the simple mathematical reality that no amount of ideology could overcome. He had seen America's industrial capacity firsthand during the train journey, the factories running at full capacity, the warehouses filled with goods, the endless streams of trucks and trains moving supplies across a continent that had never been touched by enemy bombs. He compared that to Germany's situation, factories operating in underground bunkers, supply lines constantly disrupted by Allied air raids, resources stretched impossibly thin across multiple fronts. The numbers did not lie. America could produce more tanks, more planes, more ships, more ammunition in a single month than Germany could produce in a year. And America was doing this while also supplying Britain and the Soviet Union, while fighting a 2-ocean war, while maintaining a standard of living for its civilians that exceeded anything Germany had achieved even before the war. One evening in April, Becker sat with Schmidt and several other prisoners in the common room, speaking in low voices about these realities. A prisoner named Hans Vogel, who had been an engineer in civilian life, had done calculations based on what they had observed. "The Americans have approximately 140 million people," Vogel explained, sketching figures on a piece of paper. "Germany has approximately 80 million, and we are also fighting Britain with 50 million, the Soviet Union with 190 million, and now America." We are outnumbered more than 4-1, and that is before we account for industrial capacity. The Americans produce more steel than Germany, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. They have more oil than the entire Axis powers. They have farmland that feeds not only their own people, but much of the Allied forces. Gentlemen, we are trying to defeat an enemy that outproduces us, outnumbers us, and operates from a base that cannot be touched by our weapons. This war was lost before it began. Schmidt stared at the numbers on the paper, and his face went pale. Then why did we start it? Why did Hitler declare war on America? It makes no sense. Vogel folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. Ideology does not require sense. It only requires belief. We were told we were superior, that our will would overcome material disadvantages, that Providence favored the German people. But Providence, it seems, favors logistics and industrial production. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several of the Nazi loyalists, led by a former SS officer named Karl Zimmermann. Zimmermann had been a captain in the Waffen-SS before his capture, and he carried himself with the rigid bearing of a true believer. He looked at the group gathered around Vogel with barely concealed contempt. "Defeatist talk," he said coldly. "That is what I hear. Men who have forgotten their duty, forgotten their honor. You should be ashamed." Becker met Zimmermann's gaze without flinching. "We are having a private conversation about facts, Capitan. Numbers do not care about ideology." Zimmermann's jaw tightened. "Facts? You want facts? The fact is that Germany still holds most of Europe. The fact is that our scientists are developing weapons that will change the course of the war. The fact is that we have survived 4 years of combat against the world's greatest powers, and we are still fighting. That is strength. That is will. And men like you, who sit here in comfort bought by American charity and speak of defeat, you dishonor every soldier still fighting." "But are they fighting for victory?" Becker asked quietly. "Or are they just dying for a lie?" For a moment it seemed Zimmermann might attack him. His hands clenched into fists, his face flushed with rage. But he was in an American prison camp, surrounded by guards, and violence would bring consequences. So instead, he pointed at Becker, his voice low and venomous. "When we return to Germany, men like you will be held accountable. Do not forget that. This war will end, and when it does, there will be a reckoning for traitors." He turned and walked away, his loyalists following, and the common room fell silent. The threat hung in the air, real and dangerous. But Becker found that he was not afraid. He had already lost everything: his freedom, his faith in his leaders, his belief in the cause he had fought for. What more could they take from him? As 1944 progressed, the news from the war fronts confirmed what the prisoners had begun to suspect. The Allies landed at Normandy in June, opening a second front in Western Europe. The Soviet Union pushed westward, reclaiming territory mile by bloody mile. American and British bombers reduced German cities to ash. By autumn, it was clear to anyone paying attention that Germany's defeat was not a question of if, but when. Some prisoners received this news with relief, hoping that the war's end would allow them to return home, to find whatever remained of their families and their lives. Others received it with despair, unable to accept that everything they had believed in, everything they had fought for, had been for nothing. The camp administrators began offering educational programs, classes in democracy and American civics, designed to re-educate the prisoners, to prepare them for return to a Germany that would be rebuilt along democratic lines. Some prisoners attended enthusiastically, hungry for new ideas, new ways of thinking about governance and society. Others refused, seeing the classes as propaganda, as an attempt to corrupt German youth with foreign ideology. The divisions within the camp deepened, and fights became more common, usually broken up by guards before they could turn truly violent. Becker attended the classes and found himself fascinated by what he learned. The American system of government, with its checks and balances, its separation of powers, its fundamental distrust of concentrated authority, was completely foreign to his experience. But it made a kind of sense, a protection against the very tyranny that had led Germany into catastrophe. He began to understand that the strength of America came not just from its material resources, but from its political structure, from a system that distributed power and prevented any single leader from dragging the nation into a war it could not win. When the war in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the camp received the news via a radio broadcast that was piped through loudspeakers. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. A few cheered quietly, aware that such reactions would not be well received by the Loyalists. Zimmermann and his followers withdrew to their barracks and did not emerge for 2 days. In the months that followed, as the prisoners waited for repatriation, they received more letters from home, and these were perhaps the most devastating of all. The letters described a Germany in ruins, cities destroyed, the economy collapsed, millions dead, and the full horror of the concentration camps revealed to the world. What Germany had done, what had been done in their name, was almost incomprehensible. The industrial murder of 6 million Jews, the systematic extermination of Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, homosexuals, anyone deemed unworthy of life by the Nazi regime. Some prisoners refused to believe it, called it Allied propaganda, insisted it was impossible. Others knew it was true and were crushed by the weight of that knowledge. Becker read the accounts in American newspapers, saw the photographs of the liberated camps, of the mountains of bodies, of the survivors reduced to walking skeletons. He read them and felt something break inside him. This was what they had fought for. This was the regime they had defended. Not German greatness, not European civilization, but this. Industrial murder on a scale that defied comprehension. He had not known. Most of them had not known. But ignorance was not innocence, and the guilt was inescapable. The repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, but not all prisoners chose to return. Some, like Becker, applied to immigrate to the United States or other Allied countries. They had seen enough of America during their captivity to know they wanted to be part of it, to help build something rather than return to the ruins of what they had destroyed. The process was not easy. There was paperwork, interviews, background checks, suspicion that had to be overcome. But America needed labor, needed men willing to work, and gradually permissions were granted. Becker returned to Germany only once in 1947 to find his mother and sister. He found them alive but changed, living in the rubble of Nuremberg, survivors of a catastrophe that had consumed their world. He stayed for 3 weeks, helped them as much as he could, and then returned to America. He had applied to immigrate, been accepted, and was starting a new life in Texas, working for William Harrison, the rancher who had employed him during his captivity. His mother wept when he left, but she understood. There was nothing left for him in Germany except ghosts. By the war's end, approximately 400,000 German prisoners had been held in camps across the United States. Most returned home, but thousands chose, like Becker, to stay or return later as immigrants. They became farmers, mechanics, shopkeepers, teachers, woven into the fabric of American society, bringing with them the hard lessons they had learned about the power of propaganda and the importance of seeing truth with your own eyes. Years later, when Becker was an old man working as a foreman on Harrison's ranch, a young reporter from a local newspaper came to interview him about his experiences as a POW. She asked him what he had learned from his time in the camp, what lessons he carried with him. Becker thought for a long moment, looking out over the Texas landscape he had come to love, and finally spoke. "I learned that you cannot build a great nation on lies," he said. "I learned that propaganda, no matter how sophisticated, cannot withstand the test of reality. And I learned that the greatest strength is not in weapons or ideology, but in treating people, even your enemies, with basic human decency. The Americans won the war, not just because they had more factories or more soldiers, but because they had something worth defending. We had only lies, and in the end, the lies could not sustain us." The reporter wrote down his words, and they were published in the newspaper the following week. Becker kept the clipping in a drawer in his desk, alongside his mother's letters from the war and a photograph of the camp where he had been held. reminders of how completely a life could change, how thoroughly a man could be wrong, and how the simple act of seeing truth could transform everything. The war had taught him many lessons, but perhaps the most important was this: reality always defeats propaganda in the end. Always.